This is not just a war, it is a turning point. Because right now, in a narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Hormuz, something is happening that could redefine how power works in the modern world. Not slowly, not quietly, but in real time. This narrow passage, just a few dozen kilometers wide at its tightest point, carries nearly 1/5 of the world's oil and gas supply. Every single day, millions of barrels move through it, flowing from the energy-rich Gulf toward Asia, Europe and beyond. These shipments fuel economies, power industries and sustain the modern lifestyle that billions of people depend on. For decades, this system worked with near-perfect reliability. Tankers moved like clockwork, markets operated with confidence, energy flowed without interruption, and despite decades of geopolitical tension in the region, one assumption remained constant: the strait would always stay open. That assumption was not based on trust, it was based on mutual dependence. Because closing the strait would not just hurt global markets, it would hurt Iran itself. For years Iran issued warnings. If it were attacked or pushed too far, it could close the strait. These statements made headlines, triggered brief spikes in oil prices, and then faded into the background. Most analysts saw them as deterrence, not intention. Because a full closure would be catastrophic, it would invite overwhelming military retaliation, it would isolate Iran even further, and it would damage its own already strained economy. So the world continued as if the risk was theoretical. Energy markets priced instability, shipping companies operated with confidence, governments assumed continuity. Over time, this belief hardened into certainty. But in 2026, that certainty began to crack. Tensions in the Middle East escalated rapidly. Confrontations between Iran, the United States and Israel intensified. Missiles were launched. Strategic positions were targeted. The region moved closer to open conflict than it had in years. And then, something unexpected happened. Iran did not close the strait. It did something far more subtle, and far more effective. It made the strait uncertain. This is where everything changed, because in global trade, certainty is more important than access. Ships do not move simply because they can. They move because the system around them is predictable, because routes are safe, because insurance is affordable, because risks are manageable. The moment that certainty disappears, the system begins to slow itself down. Iran understood this dynamic. Instead of attempting a dramatic high-risk blockade, it applied pressure in a calculated and controlled way. Small-scale incidents began to occur. Warnings were issued. Signals were sent that the waters were no longer completely safe. There was no official closure, no dramatic announcement. But the message was clear. Things had changed, and that was enough. Shipping companies began to hesitate. Insurance premiums surged almost overnight. Governments issued advisories, warning vessels about increased risks in the region. Suddenly, the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical energy routes in the world, began to slow down, not because it was physically blocked, but because it had become economically and strategically uncertain. This is the moment where the balance shifted. Because Iran discovered something powerful. It does not need to stop the flow of oil to control it. It only needs to make the flow unpredictable. The impact of this realization was immediate. Oil markets reacted with volatility. Prices began to rise as uncertainty spread. Countries that depend heavily on imported energy started to feel pressure almost instantly. From major industrial economies in Asia to energy-dependent regions in Europe, the ripple effects spread quickly. Because energy is not just another commodity, it is the foundation of modern civilization. When energy flows smoothly, economies grow. When energy is disrupted, even slightly, the effects cascade through every sector. Transportation costs rise, manufacturing slows, inflation increases, markets react, and all of this can be triggered without a single full-scale blockade. But while much of the world saw instability, Iran saw opportunity. For years, Iran has been operating under economic sanctions, limited trade access, and financial restrictions. Its ability to influence global systems has been constrained. But the Strait of Hormuz changed that equation, because it provided something that sanctions cannot easily remove: geographic leverage. For the first time in years, Iran was not just reacting to external pressure, it was creating pressure. From Iran's perspective, the advantages are significant. Even small disruptions can push oil prices higher. For an oil-producing country, that means increased revenue potential. even if export volumes remain limited. At the same time, countries that depend on stable energy supplies suddenly have a direct interest in what happens in the strait. That creates political pressure for de-escalation and negotiation. And perhaps most importantly, it increases strategic deterrence. Any military action against Iran now carries broader consequences. It is no longer just about regional conflict. It risks disrupting a critical artery of the global economy. That raises the cost of confrontation and shifts the balance of power. In simple terms, Iran has transformed its geographic position into a strategic asset. But this strategy is not without risk. In fact, it is inherently unstable, because the same actions that create leverage can also provoke response. For Iran, the dangers are clear. Escalation in the strait could justify direct military intervention by global powers seeking to secure energy routes. Disruption of global trade could trigger harsher sanctions and deeper isolation. And over time, the world may adapt. Countries could reduce their dependence on the strait. Alternative routes could be developed. Energy systems could shift, which means the very leverage Iran is building could eventually weaken. This creates a strategic paradox. The more Iran uses this advantage, the more the world will try to eliminate it. For the rest of the world, the situation is equally complex. On the surface, the risks dominate. Higher energy prices can drive inflation across economies. Supply disruptions can slow growth. Geopolitical uncertainty can destabilize markets. But beneath these risks lies a deeper realization. The global system has a vulnerability. For decades, the Strait of Hormuz has been one of the most critical choke points in the world. Yet global energy systems remained heavily dependent on it. Now, that dependence is being tested, and that test could drive transformation. Countries may accelerate investments in alternative energy routes. Pipelines that bypass the strait could become more attractive. Renewable energy may gain renewed urgency as nations seek to reduce reliance on imported oil. Strategic reserves may expand. Supply chains may diversify. In this sense, disruption becomes a catalyst, not just for instability, but for long-term change. This is what makes this moment so important. It is not just about conflict, it is about adaptation. Iran is adapting by discovering new forms of leverage. The world is adapting by recognizing its vulnerabilities. And both sides are adjusting in real time. What we are witnessing is not traditional warfare. It is not about territory. It is not about occupation. It is about control over systems, energy systems, trade systems, economic systems. And in this environment, power takes on a different meaning. It is no longer just about military strength. It is about influence, the ability to shape outcomes without direct confrontation. Iran has demonstrated something critical. You do not need to dominate the global system to influence it. You only need to control something the system depends on. And that realization changes everything. Because once leverage is discovered, it does not remain static. It evolves, it expands, it becomes strategy. And that is exactly what is happening now. Iran is no longer thinking only about disruption. It is thinking about control, not temporary control, but structured, strategic control. A system, a framework, a way to turn influence into something more permanent. And that leads to the next phase of this story. Because Iran is no longer asking how to disrupt the strait. It is asking something far more ambitious. What if access to this global lifeline came at a price? The $800 million strategy. What begins as uncertainty can evolve into a system, and that is exactly where this story goes next. Because once Iran realized it could influence the flow of energy through the Strait of Hormuz without fully closing it, the next logical step was not disruption, it was control. Structured, calculated, repeatable control. And control, in the modern world, is rarely just about power, it is about economics. The idea is deceptively simple. If ships must pass through the strait, and if that passage can no longer be considered completely safe, then safety itself becomes valuable, and anything valuable can be priced. Every day, roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through this narrow waterway. Massive tankers move continuously, each carrying millions of barrels worth tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on market conditions. Now imagine this. Each tanker, before entering the strait, faces a choice. Proceed without coordination and accept elevated risk. Or engage with a system that offers safer, more predictable passage. A system that comes with a cost. Even a fee of $1 to $2 million per tanker would seem small compared to the value of the cargo. For shipping companies, it could be seen not as a burden, but as a form of insurance. And that is where the strategy becomes powerful, because it does not feel like extortion. It feels like risk management. At scale, the numbers become enormous. 10 tankers per day paying an average of $2 million generates $20 million daily. That translates to roughly $600 million per month. And when liquefied natural gas shipments and additional traffic are included, the total could approach or even exceed $800 million monthly. This would place the Strait of Hormuz alongside some of the most profitable trade routes in the world, comparable in economic influence to the Suez Canal. But there is a critical difference. The Suez Canal operates under internationally recognized authority. It is a formal system, governed by established rules, widely accepted by the global community. What Iran is potentially building is something very different. A system born not from agreement, but from leverage. From the ability to create just enough uncertainty that participation becomes the rational choice. From Iran's perspective, the benefits of such a system are transformative. First, it creates a new and steady revenue stream. For years, sanctions have limited Iran's ability to fully participate in global markets. Oil exports have been restricted. Financial transactions have been constrained. Economic growth has been pressured. But a transit-based revenue model is fundamentally different. It does not rely on selling oil. It relies on controlling the pathway through which oil flows. That distinction matters, because controlling a choke point can, in some cases, be more powerful than controlling the resource itself. Second, it expands political influence. Countries that depend on stable energy flows would now have a direct stake in maintaining predictable conditions in the strait. That creates incentives for diplomatic engagement, negotiation, and potentially even concessions. Energy-importing nations, particularly in Asia, could find themselves balancing strategic relationships with practical necessities. Third, it strengthens deterrence. If disrupting Iran risks disrupting a major global energy artery, then the cost of military action increases significantly. That changes calculations in capitals around the world. But while the advantages are clear, the risks are equally serious. Because this strategy operates in a legal gray zone. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Strait of Hormuz is considered an international waterway. Ships have the right of transit passage, meaning they should be able to pass without interference. Charging fees for that passage, especially under pressure, is widely viewed as a violation of international law, and that is where tension begins to escalate. From the perspective of the United States and its allies, such a system would not just be an economic issue, it would be a challenge to the rules that govern global trade. Figures like Marco Rubio and other policymakers have already signaled that any attempt to restrict or monetize passage could trigger a strong response. Because if one choke point can be controlled this way, others could follow, and the global system, built on open navigation, could begin to fragment. Yet despite these risks, early signs suggest that elements of such a system may already be emerging. Some shipping companies have reportedly begun adjusting their routes and coordination practices. Certain vessels are communicating more closely with regional authorities. There are indications that informal arrangements may be taking shape, though details remain unclear and often unconfirmed. But in strategic terms, the exact structure matters less than the behavior. If ships begin to act as if a system exists, then in practice it already does. That is the nature of economic reality. Perception can shape behavior as much as formal policy. If enough actors believe that coordinated passage reduces risk, they will adopt it. And once adoption reaches a critical mass, the system becomes self-reinforcing. However, this creates a dangerous feedback loop, because as the system grows, so does the incentive to challenge it. For global powers, allowing such a model to solidify carries long-term risks. It could weaken international norms, encourage similar strategies in other strategic locations, and gradually shift the balance of control over global trade routes. This raises the possibility of confrontation. Naval presence in the region could increase. Escort operations could expand. Efforts to guarantee free passage could intensify. Each of these actions introduces new risks. Miscommunication, miscalculation, escalation, and in a region already under tension, even a small incident could spiral quickly. For Iran, this creates a delicate balancing act. Push too hard, and it risks provoking a coordinated international response. move too slowly, and the opportunity may fade as the world adapts. Because adaptation is already underway. Countries are exploring alternatives. Pipelines that bypass the strait are gaining renewed attention. Energy diversification strategies are accelerating. Investments in renewables are being framed not just as environmental choices, but as strategic necessities. This is the paradox at the heart of Iran's strategy. The more effective it becomes, the more it encourages the world to reduce its effectiveness. And yet in the short term, the leverage remains powerful. Because infrastructure changes take time, energy transitions take years, even decades. And in that window, control over a choke point can translate into significant influence. This is why the next phase of this story is so critical. Because what is being tested here is not just a strategy. It is a model of power that relies not on dominance, but on dependency. A model where influence is derived from positioning rather than size. And if that model proves successful, it could reshape how nations think about control in the 21st century. But it also raises a fundamental question. Can such a system exist without triggering a larger conflict? Because history suggests that control over critical trade routes rarely remains uncontested, and when it is challenged, the consequences can extend far beyond economics. They can redefine alliances, reshape strategies, and in some cases, alter the course of global history. Which brings us to the final part of this story. Because what happens next will not just determine the future of the Strait of Hormuz, it will help define the future of global power itself. The future of global power. This is no longer just about Iran. It is about the system that governs the modern world. For decades, global trade has been built on a simple principle: open access. Ships move freely across international waters. Energy flows without obstruction. Markets operate on predictability. This system is not perfect, but it has allowed global trade to expand at an unprecedented scale. And at the center of that system are choke points. Strategic locations where geography concentrates movement into narrow corridors. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important of these, but it is not the only one. There is also the Suez Canal, connecting Europe and Asia, and the Panama Canal, linking the Atlantic and Pacific. Each of these locations represents both efficiency and vulnerability. Because when global systems depend on narrow passages, those passages become points of power. What Iran is doing is testing the limits of that power. If it succeeds in transforming influence into structured control, it sets a precedent. Other nations may observe and adapt. Other choke points could become leverage points. And the global system could begin to shift from open access to negotiated access. That would be a fundamental change. From a world where movement is assumed, to a world where movement is conditional. From rules-based systems to leverage-based systems. For Iran, the potential rewards are significant. It could redefine its role in the global economy, from a sanctioned state on the margins to a central player controlling a critical artery. It could gain financial stability through transit revenues, political influence through dependency, strategic security through deterrence. But the risks remain just as high, because such a shift challenges powerful interests. Major economies depend on stable, predictable trade routes. Naval powers have long protected freedom of navigation, and any attempt to alter that balance is likely to face resistance. This resistance could take many forms: diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, military presence, or a combination of all three. The risk is not just conflict, it is escalation, a cycle where each move triggers a counter-move, where uncertainty increases, where the margin for error decreases. And in such an environment, even a small incident can have outsized consequences. For the rest of the world, the implications are profound. Accepting such a system could weaken long-standing international norms. Challenging it could risk confrontation. Ignoring it could allow it to solidify. None of these options are simple, because each carries costs: economic, political, strategic. This is why the situation in the Strait is more than a regional issue. It is a global test. A test of whether the current system can adapt, or whether it will be reshaped, because at its core, this is a story about power, not traditional power based on military strength alone, but modern power based on control of systems, energy systems, trade systems, financial systems. In this world, influence comes from positioning, from being at the center of flows, from controlling access rather than territory, and that is what makes this moment so important. because it reveals a shift from dominance to leverage, from control through force to control through dependency. The question now is not whether this shift is happening. It already is. The question is how far it will go. Will the world adapt and reinforce open systems, or will it move toward a more fragmented, negotiated order? Will choke points remain shared infrastructure, or become strategic assets controlled by individual states? The answer will not come from a single decision. It will emerge from a series of choices, by governments, by companies, by markets, and those choices are being made right now, in boardrooms, in military command centers, in diplomatic negotiations, and on the waters of one of the most important passages on Earth. Because in the end, the Strait of Hormuz is not just a location, it is a symbol of how the modern world works, and how it might change. Because when control over a single narrow passage can influence the entire global economy, it forces a realization: power is no longer just about who is strongest, it is about who controls what others depend on. And right now, that control is being tested. The outcome will shape not just this conflict, but the future of global trade itself.